The midnight silence of a house is shattered not by a scream, but by the terrifying, rhythmic wheeze of 5-year-old Adam struggling for air. Sophie, a disciplined elite nanny in her 20s, doesn't hesitate. Her dark braids sway as she moves, her navy scrubs marking her as the only moral authority in a house filled with bosses and lethal secrets. While the boy gasps, Sophie follows her instinct, grabbing shears and slicing open Adam's favorite plush teddy bear, only to reveal a high-tech monster hidden within the stuffing, a military-grade GPS tracker blinking with a predatory red light. Abruptly thrust into this golden cage, Sophie finds herself navigating a sprawling, high-security fortress in the raw, bleeding desperation of Jaden, a powerful mafia boss who is helpless to save his own son. The whole house is filled with tension, pitting Sophie's fierce protective instincts against a cold, underground world where even the nursery has become a battlefield. Before we continue with this story, kindly subscribe to our channel. The shift at the municipal hospital had been a gauntlet of sirens and shallow breathing, leaving Sophie's bones aching with a weariness that sleep couldn't touch. As she stepped into the cool, damp air of the parking garage, the fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a flickering, sickly energy. She was halfway to her car when the atmosphere changed, the hair on her arms standing up before she even saw them. Two men stood like stone pillars beside a black SUV, their forms draped in impeccable charcoal suits that seemed to swallow the dim light. They didn't reach for weapons, but their presence was a physical weight that stopped her in her tracks. One of the men stepped forward, his face a mask of professional neutrality as he held out a thick, cream-colored envelope. "Ms. Sophie," he said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. "Our employer has been watching your work. He requires the best, and the best is currently standing in this garage." Sophie's pulse hammered against her ribs, her fingers trembling slightly as she took the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000, an amount that felt like a fever dream, and a non-disclosure agreement with most of the text blacked out in heavy ink. It was an advance for 1 month of private care, a fortune offered for a single set of skills. "Who is the patient?" Sophie asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "And why isn't he in a hospital?" The man opened the rear door of the SUV, a silent invitation into a world she only knew from terrified whispers. "His name is Adam. He is 5 years old," the man replied, his eyes narrowing. "He is the heir to an empire, and he is dying because his lungs simply forget how to work." Against her better judgment, the instinct that had defined her career, the need to stand between a child and the dark, overrode her fear. She climbed into the vehicle, the scent of expensive leather and bergamot closing in around her. An hour later, the city lights faded into the iron gates of a fortress-like estate in the heights. As the SUV wound up the private drive, Sophie saw him, a silhouette framed against a massive mahogany doorway, backlit by a sudden, jagged strike of lightning. Jaden stood with a powerful, broad-shouldered frame that commanded total obedience, his dark beard groomed to perfection. But as she stepped on a marble foyer, she didn't see a monster. She saw the raw, bleeding desperation in his icy gaze. "Save my son, Sophie," he rasped, his voice a gravelly baritone that sent a shiver down her spine. "And I will give you anything you desire." The foyer was a cathedral of cold marble and echoing silence, a place where wealth felt more like a weapon than a comfort. Sophie followed the men in charcoal suits, her footsteps muffled by thick Persian rugs as she was led toward a study that seemed to sit at the very heart of the fortress. When the heavy oak doors groaned open, the air in the room vanished. Jaden stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his imposing, broad-shouldered frame silhouetted against the violent Chicago storm. He was a man of sharp angles and darker intentions, dressed in a charcoal gray three-piece suit that fit him like armor. As he turned to face her, Sophie felt a visceral jolt, a magnetic, dangerous pull that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with the man. He was devastatingly handsome, with a dark, well-groomed beard and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 secrets. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at one another, a healer and a kingpin locked in a silent evaluation. Jaden moved toward her with fluid grace, the scent of bergamot and expensive leather wrapping around her as he stopped just inches away. "You're younger than I expected, Sophie," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. "But my people say you don't flinch when things get bloody." Sophie refused to lower her gaze, meeting his icy stare with a defiance that made a fleeting, lethal smirk touch the corner of his lips. "I'm here for the boy, not for you, Mr. Collins," she replied, her voice steady despite the electricity crackling between them. The proximity was suffocating, a high-voltage tension that made it clear this wasn't just a job. It was a descent into a world where every touch was a risk. Jaden leaned in closer, his presence looming over her like a shadow. "In this house, those two things are the same," he whispered, his eyes searching hers with a raw, bleeding desperation that betrayed the monster standing before her. He gestured toward the grand staircase, his hand momentarily brushing against her arm, a spark of heat that felt like a warning. As she followed him deeper into the estate's golden cage, Sophie realized she wasn't just entering a mansion. She was stepping into the center of a storm that could protect her or destroy her entirely. Life in the East Wing was a study in gilded isolation, a web of hushed voices and heavy tension that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Adam was a sweet, fragile boy with his father's striking dark features, yet his eyes were perpetually clouded by the exhaustion of a body at war with itself. Every time Sophie attempted to adjust his monitors, she felt the icy, resentful gaze of Ami, Jaden's new wife, who paced the hallways like a restless socialite trapped in a mausoleum. Ami insisted the boy was simply seeking attention, a dismissive cruelty that was often echoed by Dr. Ray, the family's slick, arrogant physician who arrived every afternoon to update the nursery's high-tech medical suite. It was during one of these updates that Sophie's instincts began to scream. Dr. Ray stood over Adam's bed with his tablet, his fingers dancing across the screen as he calibrated the wireless sensors embedded in the nursery walls. "It's a revolutionary interface, Sophie," he said with a condescending smile. "It monitors his respiratory drive in real time. Just focus on keeping him comfortable." But as the doctor left, Sophie noticed Adam's breathing hitch, his small chest heaving as if he were fighting an invisible weight. Softly, she unbuttoned Adam's gray pajamas to check his skin for a rash, but what she found made her breath catch. Scattered across his chest, perfectly aligned with the placement of his internal medical implants, were microscopic red marks, tiny pinprick inflammations that looked less like a disease and more like localized trauma. Dr. Ray had dismissed them as an allergic reaction to the laundry detergent, but Sophie had spent enough time in the trauma ward to know the difference between a rash and a reaction to external interference. "The bear feels buzzy, Sophie," Adam whispered, his voice a frail thread as he clutched his plush teddy bear to his chest. Sophie reached out, her fingers brushing the soft brown fur of the toy. For a fleeting second, she felt it, a faint, high-frequency vibration that shouldn't have been there, a mechanical hum that pulsed in perfect synchronization with the blinking lights on Dr. Ray's monitoring equipment. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Adam's medical episodes weren't random glitches of nature. They were being triggered. Every time the nursery tech was updated, the frequency changed, and the boy who was supposed to be protected by this house was being methodically dismantled by the very things meant to save him. The golden cage was no longer just a prison. It was a laboratory, and the monster wasn't at the gates. It was sitting right there on the bed. The storm rolling off the lake was a living beast, battering the reinforced windows of the estate with such violence that the glass seemed to groan under the pressure. Inside the nursery, the air grew thick and heavy as the power grid flickered, plunging the room into a rhythmic, eerie darkness. Sophie sat by Adam's bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, watching the boy clutch his teddy bear as if it were his only anchor in the rising chaos. Suddenly, the monitors flatlined into a high-pitched, agonizing drone. Adam's body went rigid, his eyes snapping open and wide, unseeing terror as his lungs seized once again. Sophie vaulted from her chair, her professional training overriding the chill in her veins. She reached for the oxygen mask, but as her hand brushed against the plush fur of the bear, she felt it, a sharp, mechanical heat radiating from its chest. The buzzy feeling Adam had described was now a localized electronic pulse, vibrating in sync with the failing medical equipment. Rage and clarity collided in her chest. She grabbed her heavy-duty trauma shears from her kit, and with vicious, tearing force, she drove the blades into the center of the toy. The seam gave way with a jagged rip, spilling white polyester stuffing across the blue silk sheets. Sophie reached into the cavity, her fingers closing around something cold and hard. She pulled it out, a small, rectangular black plastic unit. A military-grade GPS tracker and signal jammer stared back at her, its single red LED light blinking with a predatory, rhythmic pulse. Her blood turned to ice. This wasn't just a medical sabotage. It was a beacon. Through the roar of the thunder, Sophie heard the distinct, heavy thud of tactical boots echoing in the hallway, moving with a precision that didn't belong to Jaden's usual security. She realized with sickening certainty that a hit squad wasn't just coming. They were already here, guided by the very device in her hand. The tracker was pinging their exact coordinates to someone waiting in the dark. She snatched Adam from the bed, wrapping him in a dark blanket to hide his pale frame, her eyes darting to the door as the handle began to turn. The hunter had become the hunted, and the only way out was into the shadows of a house that had suddenly become a tomb. The heavy oak door to the nursery groaned as the deadbolt clicked open, forced by a master key. Sophie didn't wait to see who stepped through the threshold. She retreated into the narrow, unlit servants' corridor, clutching Adam against her chest as the boy's breathing became a series of shallow, terrifying gasps. Behind them, Ami's voice cut through the rhythmic drumming of the rain, no longer the bored socialite, but a woman possessed by a sharp, murderous intent. "Find the nurse." Ami barked to the heavy-footed guards trailing her. "Eliminate her and bring me the boy. This ends before Jaden's helicopter touches down." Sophie descended into the bowels of the mansion, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The air grew colder, smelling of damp concrete and vintage wine as she reached the basement level. She ducked into the climate-controlled wine cellar, sliding the reinforced steel door shut and dragging a massive oak wine rack across the floor to serve as a makeshift barricade. In the dim light of her phone, she saw Adam's face turning a ghostly shade of blue. The signal jammer had done its work. His vitals were crashing. With steady, practiced hands, Sophie opened her medical kit. She didn't have a laboratory, but she had her wits. She knew the neurotoxin being triggered by the nursery tech required a counteragent to stabilize his respiratory drive. She quickly prepared a high-dose corticosteroid injection, her eyes darting to the door as the first heavy blow struck the steel. "I know you're in there, Sophie." Ami's muffled voice dripped with venom from the other side. "Open the door, and I'll let you walk away. It's the air I want, not a nanny." Sophie ignored the lies, focusing entirely on the needle. "Stay with me, Adam," she whispered fiercely, pressing her forehead against his as she administered the life-saving dose. The boy's chest gave a sudden, jagged heave, and a thin thread of air finally whistled into his lungs. Outside, the bangs grew more violent, the sound of a shotgun blast tearing through the locking mechanism. The steel door shuddered, moving the heavy wine rack inches at a time. Bottles of priceless Bordeaux shattered, the acidic scent of wine filling the cellar like blood. Sophie gripped her trauma shears, standing in front of the child she had sworn to protect, ready to drive the steel into anyone who dared to cross that threshold. She was no longer just a nanny. She was the last line of defense for the Collins empire. The roar of helicopter rotors drowned out the dying thunder as Jaden's private transport descended onto the lawn like a vengeful god. Inside the cellar, the steel door finally buckled under the guard's assault. But the first man to breach the room didn't find a helpless nanny. He met the business end of a heavy bronze lamp Sophie swung with desperate, bone-cracking force. Before the second guard could raise his weapon, the basement air exploded with a rhythmic, suppressed pop-pop-pop of professional tactical fire. Jaden burst through the threshold, his tailored charcoal suit ruined by the rain, and his knuckles split and bleeding. He didn't look at the carnage, his icy blue eyes locked onto Sophie, who was shielding a now breathing atom with her own body. The transition from terrified father to lethal kingpin happened in a heartbeat as he scooped his son into his arms. The air in the mansion grew cold with the scent of wet asphalt and bergamot as Jaden's loyal men rounded up the traitors. Ami was dragged from the shadows, her silk clothes stained with the dust of her failed coup, while Dr. Ray was zip-tied to a marble pillar, his arrogant mask replaced by a pathetic, trembling fear. Jaden didn't waste words on them in the foyer. He simply looked at his lead man, Patrick, and gave a single, terrifyingly calm order. Take them to the warehouse at the docks. Do not make it quick. As they were dragged out into the night, their screams were swallowed by the storm. An hour later, in the quiet safety of a private medical wing, the adrenaline finally crashed over Sophie, leaving her hands trembling as she wiped Adam's blood from her scrubs. Jaden sat beside her, the darkness of his world momentarily softened by the sight of his sleeping heir. He reached out, his large, calloused hand covering hers with a heat that made her breath hitch. "You fought a war for my son tonight," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated with a raw, undeniable sincerity. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes with a fierce, possessive intensity. "You saved my world, Sophie. From this moment on, you are under my protection. You will never be just a nanny to this family again." In the silence of the hospital room, a bond was sealed in blood and survival, and Sophie knew she had just become the new heart of the Collins empire. Kindly like and subscribe to this channel. Be part of our growth.